Hey, I wanted to just give a little update and just express appreciation. So, we've been doing this, I guess this will be the fourth in the last 5 weeks. And thank you. There's an increase in participation and people subscribing, especially the YouTube channel. And basically, what's happening is I'll have as few as five, as many as 30 people simultaneously watching. And then I just checked before I started this. So it's been about 5 days now. And in 5 days, my last podcast on Facebook is up to about 1,300 views. That's awesome. 50 or 60 comments. So you're listening, we're engaging, and I love pre-recording because if I mess up, I can do over. Plus, then when it live streams, then I can engage in terms of comments and feedback. So thank you. Just grateful that this is taking off. I'm really pleased with how it's going. I hope you're enjoying. The feedback I'm getting is great. And again, I'm grateful. So what we're going to do, and actually before that, let me just say, just to give you an idea. So Facebook will take the live feed offline after 30 days. So for 30 days from the live stream, you can watch it there. YouTube, I have my own YouTube channel, youtube.com/Bengali Bob. It'll stay there forever. And then podcasting. And so I've got a list here and I'm just going to pull it to read from you. So I post the podcast on Spotify, but it is on Amazon Audible, it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on iHeart, it's on Listen Notes. There's another one, Rephonic, and perhaps it's on in some other places that I'm not mentioning. But so if you're into podcasts, just look it up, Guided Life, Bob McGurty, and you can subscribe to it that way. I'd really like to see you go on the YouTube channel, Bengali Bob, and subscribe, because that's just a good way of getting the notices out. I have a lot of followers on Facebook, so that's a great place as well. But wherever you'd like to watch. So thank you. For the next few weeks, I'm going to share stories about God showing up, just God showing up. These are stories of God showing up in my life because they're my stories of when God has shown up. And I say they're Twyla's and Bobby's and Josiah's and friends and family. But I just want to take that time. And my hope is in these stories, you get this feeling that God is not just there and we're here, but he's ever present and that he does show up. And I'm so grateful that he's shown up in my life and intervened and helped me so many times. But this is going to be a two-part, this first one, and then we'll go from there. But this is a number of events that led up to my traveling to Iran in response to an earthquake that happened in Bam, Iran on December 26, 2003. So there were events that led up to that. And then next week, I'm going to share the story of Iran. And please, it is one of the most exciting stories. If you consider this little tidbit, Elizabeth Dole, then American Red Cross International Director, Jeb Bush, then the governor of Florida, were denied visas to Iran. Bob McGurty got one. It's just a story of God showing up, and I look forward to telling that. But I have to go back a little bit and begin with the story before the story. So the year's 2003. We are heading to our missionary furlough time from serving in Bangladesh. We're coming home to the U.S. and there's another story, another time that I'll tell that happened a year later when we were home. That's tied to the tsunami, and that hopefully Twyla will share in that story, and maybe Josiah as well. But so the year's 2003, we've been serving in Bangladesh for 14 years, and we're in that season where we know something is going to change. We're not sure what, but we know that change is in the air. And we were given some offers of things that we could do. We were in conversation about transitioning to work with healthcare ministries, maybe. There were some other offers that were out there. And it started to get confusing because you're coming on furlough, you're going to be home a year, and it just was like all this noise, and it's hard to focus when you're hearing from multiple voices. And I just got into my prayer time, and I felt like the Lord just spoke to me and said, 2003 is not the year to make a decision. So that was freeing because at this point, it's about May of 2003. We're on our way home. We're going on furlough. We're going to spend a year telling the story of what we're doing, raising funds, going back. So we had like a 6-7 month reprieve from decision making. So September 2003, I'm in a thrift store shopping, looking around, and I get a phone call from Joanne Butrin. Dr. Joanne Butrin was the director of healthcare ministries, and that is medical outreach arm of the Assemblies of God. And I had worked quite a bit with healthcare ministries. I had traveled with them. We hosted a bunch of teams in Bangladesh. I hosted teams in other parts of Eurasia, including Jordan and India and some other countries. But Joanne had called me, and most of you know this, but Twyla and I have a medical background. And so there's an affinity towards healthcare related type work. And so this call happens in September of 2003. And basically, Dr. Butrin said, Bob, need to talk to you. I'm here in John Bueno's office, and Brother John Bueno at that point was the World Missions Director for the Assemblies of God, AGWM. And she said, I'm sitting in his office and on his behalf, and I'm calling to ask you if you would consider becoming the director of healthcare ministries. Joanne was being promoted. She was going to be a regional director overseeing international ministries. And it was flooring to think that I would be invited to such a position. But immediately my mind was 2003 is not the year of decision making. So this is September 2003. And I said, well, Joanne, my first question, it sounds exciting. And Twyla and I love healthcare ministries. We love the work. We're looking at potential change, set all that up. But I said, when do you need a decision by? And my thought was that she was going to give an answer that was within the next 3.5 months. I mean, it's September. A decision like that, a potential like that, you don't just hold on for months for someone to pray and think and decide. And so I knew that if her statement was any date before December 31st, the answer was no. And it was because I felt clearly that 2003 was not a year to make decisions. So I asked her, when do you need to know by? And she said, well, we're having a get together of all the international media directors, ministry directors, international ministry directors. And that meeting is going to be in February. So I really need to know before that meeting. And I was like, oh man, this could be the next thing we're doing, because at that point I knew that there was a possibility. And I said, well, is it okay if I don't let you know until January? In fact, her and I and a number of others were going to be together for a medical mission strategy committee in January, middle of January. I said, I will let you know by then. She said, that'll be fine. So hung up the phone. I called Twyla. I think she was at work. And I said, are you sitting down? And said, we've been asked to be directors of healthcare ministries. And she said, well, what did you tell them? And I said, well, you remember 2003 is not the year of decisions. And she goes, so you're not going to do that? And I said, well, I asked when they needed to know, and the response was February. So I committed that I'll let her know at the Medical Mission Strategy Committee in January. So, and she goes, wow, that's amazing. You know, God knows, and we'll see. And so, um, hung up the phone, and something happened. And again, the theme of this storytelling season for the next few weeks is when God shows up. And and I know the audience I'm talking to all have different views of God and who God is and who he is to you personally. And so I can only tell it from my lens. So if this is foreign to you, if it doesn't make sense, I'm going to try to break it down simply, but I just have to say, I just had this impression from God, this overwhelming impression, and I felt like I needed to go and check my emails. And just like this overpowering check your emails. And so I go to my computer and I start, and it was just so overwhelming. It was just the presence of God. No other way to explain it. If you understand it, you understand it. If you don't, I don't know how to explain it. But I felt the presence of God, and so I started to check the email. I stopped. I went back. I was praying, and this went on at least 20 to 25 minutes. And so finally, I begin to read this email. Now, I have to explain this a bit. This is September. Earlier that year in January, I was in Calcutta, and every January 26th, plus or minus 2 or 3 days, January 26th is Indian Republic Day, but every year in January, we have our big board meeting around Indian Republic Day. And so that particular time, we had our hospital board meeting, and as board members, we were all meeting for lunch at a restaurant that was down the road from the hospital, probably about a 5 or 6 minute walk. It's called Barbecue Nation. It was an upstairs, and and so I wanted to visit a patient that I had visited that morning and prayed with. And so I just said, hey, save me a seat. I'll catch up. So I went and visited the patient and came down off of the pediatric floor and was walking in the hallway. And there was a man, and I want to say his name was Greg Cohic, Cohic. I believe that was his name. And he was walking down the hallway. Well, you know, I mean, the bottom line is in Calcutta, India, at Mercy Hospital on the first floor, you don't run into a whole bunch of foreigners. And if I do run into one or two, I know them or I know of them, and they either know me or they know of me. And so here was this man I didn't know, he didn't know me, and he began to tell me a story. His father was the vice president of an organization that was based in Illinois called Cure International, Cure. And he had been in Mumbai, and Cure International was involved in helping with surgical equipment, orthopedic surgical equipment. And he had heard about our hospital and just randomly showed up, didn't have a contact, had an address, showed up. And he goes, I'd really like to meet with some leadership, see if there's a way that we can connect on surgeries, maybe donate things. And I said, well, it just happens that the entire board is having lunch, and just come as my guest. And so I gave him my missionary prayer card that had my name, and that'll become important in this story. And so that's it. I give him that card. We walk together. We're chatting. I'm finding out about him. He's finding out about me. And the seat that had been saved for me at the lunch table was right near the CEO of the hospital, as well as one or two other real critical people that were important for Greg to meet. So I said, Greg, you take this seat. I'm going to pull up a seat and I'm going to sit somewhere else. So I only met Greg in the hallway and walking to the restaurant. And then afterwards, he shook my hand. He thanked me. He said, boy, that was so strategic. Thanks for giving your seat. Thanks for making the connections. This is going to be good. And never heard from him again, but he had my prayer card. So he tells me this story. And he's telling the story of a radiator, some say, this heat unit that in his house outside of the suburbs of Chicago was not working. So he's emailing me. He has the email from my prayer card. We met one time and it was in Calcutta. We didn't have a follow-up conversation. There was no need to. He met the people he needed to meet, and he didn't give me a card. I only gave him a card. And so he's telling this story. This is a God shows up story. And in this story, he tells about this radiator that wasn't working, and they had gone through a series of technicians, and then they brought the master, the expert. And so this guy is in the middle of fixing the radiator, and it has on it these curios, these tribal Maasai tribe little kind of curio things on top of the radiator. And this guy is asking, well, what's this? And he begins to share faith with this man. Now, this is the story behind the story, or the God show up sort of thing. The person who is fixing Greg Kohig outside of Chicago's radiator is the father of the guy he met in Calcutta. My dad is fixing his radiator, and he begins to share faith with my father. And my father's like, what the heck? And my father had more colorful language, let's just say, and was trying to figure this out, was not, of the same persuasion as me in terms of faith and belief. And this guy's sharing about God with him. And he goes, I'm talking to this guy and I'm sharing faith with him. And I'm telling him that these curios were because I grew up as a missionary kid in Africa, and we worked with the Maasai tribe, and these are Maasai. And he goes, oh, missionary, my son's a missionary. And he goes, really? Where at? He said, Bangladesh. He goes, I met a missionary from Bangladesh a couple of months ago. Hold on a minute. Let me go get his card. And so he goes up and gets my card and hands my father, who him and I were not in a good, healthy relationship at that point. And my father's name is Bob McGurty. So Greg hands Bob McGurty's prayer card. And so now let's just back up a little bit. I've been offered to be the director of healthcare ministries. I've called my wife and talked about it. I'm in this bubbly thing of something going on and feeling impressed to read an email and stopping and praying and stopping and praying. And so I just have this overwhelming presence of God. And now it's just kind of weird where the rubber meets the road. And I say, okay, God, this is wild, but what does this mean? What in the world does this mean? And I felt like the Lord impressed in my heart and said, you tell people that your ministry gift is relationships, and you need to work on your relationship with your father. And if you will work on your relationship with your dad, then I will make clear what your next steps are, what your path is, what's next. Because I'm just trying to know. And again, 2023 is not the year of decision. So, and now I'm going to wind this up and set it up for part B. So here we are. Let's just recap this, because I know, and I'm a rabbit trail gifted person. So if it doesn't make sense to you, what I'm telling a story about is God showing up. And here's what happens is I am in 2003 getting ready to head home on furlough, having a sense that there's a change, having confusion, and hearing God say 2003 is not the year to make a decision. 3.5 months later, I'm offered a decision. I'm offered a direction that I need to make a decision on. And the deadline is after 2003, in 2004, in January. And have this presence of God, overwhelming, goosebumpy. And I'm praying, and I get to this email of a guy who one time in my life, 6 to 8 months ago, halfway across the world, we met in a hallway, we shook hands, we walked to a restaurant, and we were done. I handed him a prayer card. And 6.5 months later, My father, who I'm not in close relationship with at that time, is working on his radiator. And he says, I sense there's a disconnect between you and your dad. If there's anything I can do, let me know. And then I'm trying to make sense out of this story. And God says, you work on your relationship with your father, and I'll make clear your next steps. And my Aunt Nancy, you know I love you if you're watching this. My Aunt Nancy's always been a bridge builder. There's a lot of parts to my story, but I said, I'm going to call Aunt Nancy. And I call Aunt Nancy and I said, hey, want to come to see you? Because I had just questions about my dad and our relationship and all. And so my Aunt Nancy and I get together. I think I was somewhere nearby. She lives in New Jersey. And so we have one of our late nights, and she's pulling out old photos and we're telling old stories. And my Aunt Nancy's just one of my favorite human beings in the world, and a very accepting, a very kind soul. And we're talking about my dad. And so, and my dad and I at this point had not talked in probably nearly 10 years or so. And I knew that this night would end with Aunt Nancy calling my dad and the three of us having a conversation. And my dad's like, man, I got to tell you about this guy and this radiator thing. And it begins a process where my dad and I start reconnecting. I'm working on this thing. This was an instruction from God. Work on your relationship with your dad. So I'm going to put this story on pause and maybe leave you cliffhanging a bit. But in the next part, I'm going to show how that relationship gets clarified, how an earthquake happens in Iran, and I happen to go to Iran, and pieces come together. This series is about when God shows up, and let me just get personal with you and in your face. My hope and my prayer for you is that God shows up in your life, in your situation, whatever you're going through, have gone through, and whatever you believe about God or however you understand him. I know him to be real. And my hope and my prayer for you is that God would just really show up in your life and help you, and that you'll find people will help you to hear from God. And so, again, the recap of this story, quite simply, is all about when God shows up. And we were in a season looking for direction, and maybe you wouldn't say that was God, that was a coincidence, but hang with me, hear more of this story. And what are the chances that some guy in Calcutta, that at that moment in the hallway I would meet and give a card to, what are the chances that 6.5 months later, my father and him would have an encounter, and my dad, Bob McGurty, by a third party, would be handed a prayer card of Bob McGurty? I don't think it's a coincidence. I think God just shows up in our lives. Love and appreciate you.